Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 18, verses 1 through 13, where Jesus is betrayed and arrested. We pick up in chapter 18, verse 1, when Jesus has spoken these words, and the words that he has spoken, first of all, we saw him way back in chapter 13 washing the disciples' feet, and then he goes on to explain that. And that leads to a whole series of discussions and dialogue with the apostles, where in chapter 14 he talks about how he's going. Chapter 15 was the pivotal point about they need to abide in him. Chapter 16, again, he talks about how he's going. Actually, in both chapters 14 and 16, as well as 15, he talks about I'm going to send a comforter, the Holy Spirit. Chapter 17, he had been speaking, instead of to his disciples, he had been speaking to the Lord about his disciples. He'd been praying. And now that the prayer is over and all the talking part is finished, we come to chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron. Now, all this time, as they've been talking, they've been on their way out to this area. Maybe they pause once in a while. They pass through Jerusalem. They pass out the gates. They pass into this. And notice, as you go to the east of the city of Jerusalem, there's a valley there. This valley section, the Kidron Valley, joins up with the Hinnom Valley over on the left-hand side of our chart. So this whole valley system surrounds Jerusalem. And on the east side of that valley, to the right, is the Mount of Olives. But they're not going to go to the top of the Mount of Olives. They're just going to go to the lower slopes. And so notice there's a ravine of the Kidron where there was a garden. Now, when you say a garden is a garden. First of all, it's got plants in it, but also a garden is always surrounded by a wall. Really? Yes, a garden in the ancient world, that's what set it off. It was surrounded by a wall. For example, in the Garden of Eden, remember that? In the story of the Garden of Eden, there was an entrance, so that by the entrance, and now how can you have an entrance if there's no wall around it? It was closed off, and at the entrance, God had stationed after the man and the woman had sinned, after Adam and Eve had sinned, he had stationed a cherub, with a flaming sword. Well, there's no flaming sword here, but he's going to enter the garden. The reason you can enter a garden is because it has a wall around it, and it has some sort of entryway, a gate or something like that. And Jesus enters here with his disciples. You go to that area today, just outside the city of Jerusalem on the east side, and you cross the Kidron Valley, and just on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, there is a garden. Now, these aren't the trees that were there back then. I've been told that these trees were tested with dating method testing, and they are around 900 to 1,000 years old, which is very old. They're very big. They're gnarly. They've been there a long time, but they're not the trees that were there in Jesus' day. And so there's a wall around this garden too, but I'm not saying it's the same wall or the same garden. But in the general area, notice they've planted this garden of olive trees where the Garden of Gethsemane, and we're not told in John's account the name of it. I mentioned it because it's mentioned in one of the synoptic gospels, but where this garden was located, it's probably in the same general area at least. Verse 2, now Judas also. And before we saw a Judas who was not Iscariot. This is the Judas Iscariot. Judas also, who was betraying him. Notice that that's taking place. Now is the time. We've already seen in the Gospel of John that he was going to betray him. But Judas Iscariot knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. It was a regular meeting place. Jesus knew about it, the disciples knew about it, Judas knew about it, and because Judas knew about it, he's going to be the betrayer and lead those who are trying to arrest Jesus. He is going to lead them to the place where he will be by himself with his disciples, but away from the crowds. It's the middle of the night. And so Judas had been intending to betray him back in chapter 12, verse 4. One of his disciples, Judas Iscariot. By the way, the term Judas Iscariot, that last part is it's Hebrew, not Greek. Now it's written with Greek letters, but Iscariot means man from Kerioth, Ish Keriot, you would say. And apparently that's where he was from. It's thought that that's probably somewhere in the area of Judea down in the south, whereas most of the other disciples, if we know where they're from at all, they seem to come for the most part from up in Galilee to the north. So maybe Judas was a little bit, geographically on the outs. I don't know that they didn't anticipate he was going to be betraying them. Jesus knew, but they didn't know. And when Jesus had said, "One of you is going to betray me," they didn't all look at Judas. But we read in chapter 13, verse 2, at that point, at that time where they had gathered in the upper room and Jesus had washed their feet. Notice the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. So the plan was already there. He was intending, it was a satanic plan, a plan from the devil. And Judas goes and has his feet washed, knowing full well that he's going to do that. And now, a few hours later, here's Judas he's had to go and collect the soldiers. He's had to contact the Jewish authorities, and by the instance in which they have all gathered so quickly and efficiently together, it looks like they were all prepared and planned, and now they show up at this meeting place. Verse 3, Judas then, having received, notice the Roman cohort. Now notice that word Roman is italicized. That's the translators of the New American Standard. They are trying to be helpful. I would say that the vast majority of the times when they add a word like that, and that's what the italicized part means, it means they added that word. It wasn't in the Greek text. They're trying to be helpful, and they mean to be helpful, but maybe they're not, because it never tells us it was a Roman cohort. Now, it does describe a cohort, and that's, typically around, if it was official, then that would be, I don't know, around 600 people or so. I don't think it was necessarily that many, but there was a number of people. It wasn't just, 2 or 3 soldiers. It's bigger than that. So notice the cohort, and this is the Greek word, the speira. It's a Greek word, not a Roman word. And that Greek designation is also found in the book of 2nd Maccabees. That's one of the apocryphal books. And that just shows us that the term can be used of non-Roman troops, because in 2nd Maccabees, it's not talking about Romans, it's talking about Greeks. We would say a company, maybe a battalion. And having said that word battalion, I have to stop and chuckle, because in my firefighter years, I spent a whole career with the fire department while I was teaching the Bible. I went up through in the ranks from lieutenant to captain to what they called a battalion chief. You say a battalion, that's like a whole bunch of people. Well, I didn't have that many people under me, even though I had the title. And that might be the case here. We're going to see some titles. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how many people were there. I think there were a lot of people there, but maybe not way up in the hundreds and even more. So there's a cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Now, you might argue, well, only the officers were from the chief priests and Pharisees, and maybe the cohort was Roman, and maybe it was, but we're not told that. It sounds like all of these have come from the chief priests and Pharisees. And the chief priests and Pharisees didn't give orders to Romans. If anything, it went the other way. The Romans were the ones in charge. The chief priests and Pharisees, especially the chief priests, did have what they called the temple officers. They didn't have, they could actually technically arrest a Jewish subject. They couldn't arrest a Roman subject, and they were not allowed to put anybody to death. And we're going to see that next time when we begin to see the trials. But they did have authorities, and so this might be the chief priests authorities, and they come with the Pharisees. And notice they come there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So, and I find it interesting. We're going to see a lot of collections of threes in this description. Now, maybe that means nothing except John, the writer here, is being descriptive. But maybe there's a little bit more. We're just going to keep our eye out and our ears open to those sets of threes that are given to us. Verse 4, so Jesus, knowing all things that were coming upon him, and this hasn't taken Jesus by surprise. He has announced it. We've been told. He even knew that he knew who was going to betray him. He knew that Judas was going to do it. So he knows, notice, not just that thing, but all things that were coming upon him. He knows what's ahead. He knows how it's going to end up. He has prophesied how it's going to end up. And so knowing all of these things, that basic word eidos, the perfect active participle of oido, is a basic word for knowledge. Now, if I had, there's about 3 different terms for knowledge, and if I had to sort of arrange them into what is the most strenuous, this wouldn't be the most. You can say something even like super knowledge, epignosis, but he knew. What I want to point out, though, is the perfect active participle. The perfect tense means that he had known, or we could say he had been knowing, or however you want to do that, uh, action that took place in the past with continuing results. And so as we come up, he'd already known, and he was still knowing all the things that were coming upon him. He went forth and said to them, and he asked the question now, whom do you seek? So the question, by the way, notice how he went forth. Literally, he went out, um, ex Elthen, and the X part is like, you know how we have the word exit? It's a little bit like that. So he went, but he went out. So maybe he goes out to the entrance of the garden. We're not told what he went out of, but he went forth, he went out from where he was. And since they're in a garden, maybe he goes to the entrance and sort of meets them as they're wanting to come in. He meets them at the entrance. He's not trying to escape, but he's not hiding. He's going out, and he asked them, whom do you seek? Verse 5, they answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. Now, I have read some authors that wanted to say, well, there's a difference between Jesus the Nazarene versus Jesus of Nazareth. I don't think that's the case. If I say I am John from Florida or John the Floridian, I'm really saying the same thing. It's just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. And so I think that's the case. And he said to them, I am, and my translation says, I am he. Now, the translation is not wrong. Let me say, let me speak it. But notice the word he is italicized. Literally, it's I am, the way you say that in Greek. And you could say it 1 of 2 ways. You could just say, I me, which would be I am. Or you can emphasize the I part, and it's not that big of an emphasis, so don't make too big of a deal of it. But you can say, ego I me. Ego I me would be, say, I am, literally, but it's still the same idea. But when you hear that, we've already heard that phrase a number of times where Jesus said things like, I am the light of the world, and I am the vine, and I am the good shepherd. And at one point in John chapter 8, verse 58, before Abraham was, I am. And that's exactly the same phrase that we've heard in each of those cases. And so as he goes and says to them, I am, you sort of hear just a little bit the echoes of those previous I am statements. But it's okay that it said I am he, because the he is understood even though it's not specifically stated. So you don't have to say it the other way, but you can, and perhaps I think you would, having already heard all of those other I am statements. Okay? So it's okay that the translators put I am he. That there's nothing wrong with that. But I also want you to hear that in context with everything else he said, all of those I am statements, because those I am statements pointed to who he was as far as as we've said, God in the flesh, the one who became flesh and dwelt among us, the one who was the Word and was with God and was God. So he says that to him, to all of them. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with him. So you notice John the writer is setting the stage. You've got Jesus, you've got Judas, you've got the people. Jesus gives this statement, ego I me. And now, verse 6, so when he said to them, I am, and it's the same ego I me. Now notice, Jesus didn't say it a second time yet, but we're being told a second time that he said it, just as we have the story being described. And I want you to count not only how often Jesus says it, but how often John describes Jesus saying it. So we only have one instance, but so far we have two descriptions. And so when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And you say, what? What was that? And we're not told, how did this happen? Was this just they took a step back and they were maybe too packed in, and so the front guy tripped over the back guy, and the back guy tripped over, and they fell to the ground. It looks like somebody was bowling, and you threw the ball and it hits the pins and they all go flying down to the ground. And we're not told how or why. It catches us by surprise. Let me just say, it caught them by surprise too. Reminds me of a time I mentioned I used to be a firefighter. We were on this fire, and it was this big old truck of some sort, like a heavy piece of machinery, and it was burning around both the base, but also where one of these big truck tires were, and those things are pretty big. And I was on the nozzle. I was just a young firefighter at the time, and putting the wet stuff on the red stuff, like we used to say, and the tire actually exploded. Now those things can hurt you if you're too close, and I was probably closer than I needed to be, and the big bang, the explosion of this tire just blowing apart, sort of. It was such a big surprise. I wasn't expecting it. Maybe I should have been. And I jumped back, still holding the nozzle. It didn't go flying or anything, but almost. I said I almost landed on the lap or in the arms of the firefighter behind me that was helping me hold the hose. And that reminds me of this, because, and there's not an explosion. There's just him saying the statement, "I me, I am." And just as if there had been an explosion, they draw back, and they fell to the ground. And you can see them. They sort of get up, sort of sheepishly. What was that about? And verse 7, therefore he again asked them, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Verse 8, Jesus answered, "I told you that I am," and there it is again. And as he asked him, "Who do you seek?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." I can picture them bracing themselves, like, "I'm not going to fall down again. Is this going to happen a second time?" But Jesus answered them, "I told you that I am." Notice that's the third time that John has recorded those words. Jesus only said them twice, but we have three times, I am, I am, I am. And I want you to count that, because that's going to be relevant to the story next time. Right now we're seeing three times I am. Next time we'll see somebody saying, I am not. But we'll come to that in a bit. But I want you to see that as part of the story. I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way, to fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. Now notice, let these go away. Let these go their way. He's speaking of the disciples, and they've come to arrest Jesus, and there's a big crowd come to arrest Jesus, and they've got officers, and they've got the soldiers, the guards, the cohort. We're going to see in a minute. We haven't mentioned that the leader yet, and they've come to take charge, to take him into their custody, and instead he's actually the one giving instructions and orders. Now, I've been in the capacity of both firefighter, and before that we were public safety back in the very old days, and as a result, I've seen lots and lots of people being arrested and put into restraints and things like that. And the person being put into restraints, the person being arrested, isn't usually the one giving orders. And the people putting on the restraints are not taking orders, but that's what's happening here. So notice, if you seek me, let these go their way. And by the way, they're going to do it. They're going to obey, just like he spoke and they fell down. And this is all happening to fulfill the word which he spoke. And now we have the quote of what he had said just a bit earlier. of those whom you have given me. That's when Jesus was praying to the Father. Those of you who have given me, I lost not one. And it's a reference back to John chapter 17, verse 12, where Jesus had been praying, while I was with them, I was keeping them in your name, which you've given me, and I guarded them, and not one of them perished. I didn't lose any, but the son of perdition, who was there, Judas Iscariot is there, that the scripture would be fulfilled. In other words, what was happening here, and we looked at that back in chapter 17, verse 12, so I'm not going to look at any further. But he's citing his own prayer, which itself was citing a passage from the Old Testament, that this had all been prophesied, and now it's playing out just the way it was supposed to. Verse 10, Simon Peter then, having a sword, and the term sword, in fact, I've seen some translations that actually, instead of putting sword, they'll put a dagger, and there's a reason for that. The Greek term here is a makarion. The makarion is, there's a different word that can be a big old sword, a rampha, but this is a makarion, that is usually like it's bigger than a kitchen knife, but it's not as big as a full-size sword. Sort of I'd say roughly around 18 inches, like a cubit, like about the length of from your fingertip to your forearm. And we had in the other gospel accounts, not John. This is the first time we've seen the sword here. But in the other accounts, Jesus had talked about the importance. He said, "Look, I told you before." Um, uh, Turning plowshares into swords, or turning swords into plowshares, and you don't need to take along a sword, but now take one. And the disciples, among all 11 disciples, because Judas hadn't been there, they said, "Well, we've got two," and Jesus had said, "That's enough." So let me say, if you're taking this as far as this passage and what Jesus had said earlier, as whether or not you should have arms and guns and things like that, if among all your friends there's two, that's enough. Because Simon Peter, notice he's got one of the two. And Simon Peter then, having a sword, having this makarion, drew it and struck the high priest's slave. Now, the term slave here isn't just a servant. It's actually the Greek word doulos, a typical slave. It's the regular word for that. Although as a slave, he might have been under orders, and he was probably there to give some added muscle. We don't know exactly why. In fact, we're going to find out not only is he there, but a relative of his is there. There's sort of like a slave family that's represented there. So the slave of the high priest, notice, and cut off his right ear. I don't think Peter was aiming for the ear. I think Peter wasn't very good with a sword. After all, he was a fisherman instead of a swordsman, and he was planning on taking the fellow's head off or splitting it down the middle or something, but he missed. I guess that's okay for Malchus that he missed. We're going to find out the slave's name, and the slave's name was Malchus. The other gospel accounts don't mention the name of the slave. The other gospel accounts don't mention who had the sword that was doing the swinging. And that might be because they're trying to sort of protect Peter. John, I don't know when John is writing this account. I think John is writing at a later date. Is he writing at a time when Peter has already been put to death? And if so, we don't need to protect Peter because he's already been taken and executed, which church tradition tells us that Simon Peter was eventually executed. So yet both Simon Peter's name is mentioned, but also the slave's name. Malchus is mentioned. And of course, this is not a Greek name. This is a Hebrew name from the term Malek. And now there's two words that sound alike. You can have Melech, which would be a king. I don't think the slave was named king. Could have been maybe, but Malach is a messenger. It's also the word for an angel, but a messenger could be a heavenly messenger, a earthly messenger, and it could be that this fellow had been out all night passing messages as Judas Iscariot had given his message, and then he was helping to gather and send the word out and gather all the troops and the soldiers that are there, and he's come along for this. And it's interesting, his right ear is taken off, is injured. Notice it says cut off, and I'm going to take that fairly literally. And it's interesting that when you look at the Torah, the Old Testament, both Exodus and Leviticus, and I gave you the passages here, there was a ceremony that when the high priest or any priesthood was being ordained, it involved taking sacrificial blood and placing it on their right ear. Now, maybe again, that's just happenstance, but I can't help but notice that John mentions not just that his ear was cut off, but his right ear was cut off. And maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe you're supposed to hear, look, high priest, here's the high priest who'd had blood on his ear at one point, and now his slave has blood on his ear. Um, and and maybe there's a connection, a loose connection, where this slave, who is not a high priest, he's not a priest at all that we know of. He's actually just a slave, and yet his name is given. And I think maybe the reason his name is given is because he's going to go from being the slave of the high priest to being Malchus the believer, whose name might have been known to other Christians. And if he becomes Malchus the Christian, then that means he also becomes the Malchus the priest, not literally physical priest like in the Jewish priesthood, but part of the kingdom of priests, because that's God's people. And so I just find it interesting, the details, and maybe the reason why the details are given, and how perhaps we can just think through why those details might have been included. Now, Luke chapter 22, verse 51, and this is the only account that mentions this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all talk about the slave, all talk about his ear. Luke, the physician, I think of him as the first responder, physician. But Jesus answered and said, according to Luke's account, stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. John doesn't mention the healing. Matthew, Mark, they don't mention the healing. Only Luke, the physician, mentions it. The others are just so overcome with the blood, and they forget the part about the healing. Or maybe that's just not germane to their part of the story. We continue into verse 11. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Now, in the synoptic accounts, we had seen Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was praying, Lord, if there's any way to have this cup removed from me. But John didn't have that prayer. John had a very different prayer. I think they were both prayed in the garden. I don't think one is telling us the correct story and the other one isn't. They're just focusing on different aspects of what Jesus prayed. So John hasn't mentioned the cup in this regard. He's talking about eating the bread, eating the body, and drinking the blood, things like that. But here, this reference to the cup is mentioned in some of John's other writing, and I'm speaking here of the book of Revelation, where Revelation chapter 14 and verse 9, and we have a warning here that talks in Revelation chapter 13 talks about this beast and a mark of the beast and so on. But here in chapter 14, if anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength and here it is, the cup of his anger. And I think we can take these later words in Revelation and connect them with John's earlier words and the words that Jesus speaks through John's story to identify what is this cup about, that I think it is the cup of the wine of the wrath of God. I think it is the cup of the anger of the Lord, the cup that he would drink by going to the cross, the cup that he would drink so we do not have to drink. You see, when we drink of the body and blood of Jesus, when we have the Lord's Supper, we're not drinking the cup of wrath. We're drinking the cup that he gave us, because he took the wrath of God upon himself, which means that it does not come to us. It has already been drunk. It's already past us, because he drank it on our behalf. He took the penalty for the judgment that belonged to us, and he bore that penalty on himself. It's not that God got angry at him, but no, he took that anger that would have been directed toward us, and he bore the penalty upon himself. And so verse 12, so the Roman cohort, again, remember the cohort that not necessarily Roman, and the commander. Now, commander wasn't mentioned earlier, but now he is uh, the uh, the Kiliarchos. The Kili is actually the word for 1,000, and an archos is like the beginning or the head or the ruler, the guy that's the commander. So the commander of 1,000. Now, again, I don't think there were necessarily 1,000 soldiers there. Um, but I find it's interesting that you've got a big time commander. At least that's the term that's used here. And so notice you've got the commander and the officers of the Jews, and they arrested Jesus. Now notice the officers, the huperetai. And I guess some people have noted the under rowers, but don't take that literally. I don't think they heard that part. Officers, servants, that works nicely. And that's a general term. It can be used in a variety of ways, and sometimes it's even used of those who are leaders and maybe officers or workers in the church as well. But notice the commander and the officers of the Jews. So you've got the cohort, the commander, and the officers, and they arrested Jesus and bound him and led him. And notice again, you had three groups: the cohort, the commander, and the officers. And then they arrested and bound and led. So we keep seeing that number three, just like we had three times describing how Jesus said, "I am." Now he only said it twice, but one of those was referencing back to the first time. And that three times keeps coming back at us again and again. And hold that thought for next time when we come back. But so verse 13, they led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And we'll pick up the story next time with these two verses as Jesus is led away. We've seen the betrayal, we've seen the arrest, but now we're going to be on the road to the crucifixion. And we'll see that next time.